Thanks so very much. I thought I might just start with a little bit of an introduction. I've been on holiday here at Byron Bay for the last 6 weeks, so I'm hoping I remember things still. You know, there's a way holiday has a brain turning to mush. I'm married to an Australian man and lived in Australia some years ago and actually worked for the Commission for the Future. Some of you are old enough to maybe remember that, where I sort of put together a national program for sustainable development. And that's really been my passion for most of my professional life. I've only been an academic for about 7 years, worked before that in the NGO sector, doing research, doing consulting, working with companies, working with international organizations, and now really committed very much to bringing both the professional and the academic rigor in the training of students. The Monterey Institute of International Studies is a professional graduate school based in Monterey, but we are an affiliate of Middlebury College. It's a 2-year program. Our aim is to train our students up quickly, get them out working. Some of them will do PhDs, many of them will not. It's really what I try to do. So I'm honored to be called a natural resource specialist, but I tremble on that because really more of my specialty is in this area of macroeconomics and trying to understand. I've done quite a bit of work on how foreign investment in particular does or does not, can or cannot really promote development and a sustainable form of development, especially in a developing country context. So in that context, I was asked by the Global Development and Environment Institute to take on this study of the Marlin mine. The Marlin mine, many of you may have already encountered it in Guatemala, has been the object of intense international attention, conflict, and controversy. All the way up to the point where in June of 2010, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights ordered a suspension of the mine out of concern for water contamination of the indigenous people in the area. So there's a lot of heat been generated around this mine. I was asked to do a study to say, okay, we know there are some human rights concerns. What about the economic benefits of the mine? Let's figure out, you know, what is actually being generated there, and in a long and short-term point of view, and could I spearhead this investigation? So, being, you know, somewhat perhaps a little quick, I said, oh, sure, because it turned out to be much more complex than I ever imagined. So what we did was we put together this report. I brought a copy to leave with your center, Salim, so a little memento, which just came out at the end of last year. And since then, I've done further work to develop a theoretical framework. So just a quick introduction first to where we are here. The Marlin mine is in the northwestern highlands of Guatemala. This is called the Altiplano, an area that is inhabited almost exclusively by indigenous Mayan groups. And that's actually me in the corner there. Just to let you know, I really did go there. We did some field research. So how was I going to take this on? This idea of, you know, trying to assess the economic costs and benefits of the mine. That's what I promised. And I said that I would do this by looking at the social, environmental, and economic benefits and costs on both sides. So I thought I would do a cost-benefit framework. But my starting point here, in a sense, is to say, now hang on a minute, how can mining ever promote sustainable development? Because it's based on a non-renewable resource. It's inherently unsustainable. If it's 10 years or 40 years, the resource itself will be depleted. So how can we think about that as a sustainable industry? So my starting point was to say, well, let's talk about what we might call the weak sustainability principle, a principle in environmental and resource economics, which basically says that we can substitute different kinds of capital, human, natural, and social. Okay, we start with that. And we can say that mining can contribute to sustainable development if it generates long-term benefits, put them all in there, environmental, social, economic, that are at least what it took away or before the mining happened. That what we end up with at the end is more than what we had when the mining started. Okay? That's what we're going to call sustainable development, using this weak sustainability principle. So how can we assess these benefits, subtract the cost, and see if in fact in the end we're going to have benefits at a particular project? I thought I might use a classic sort of a cost-benefit analysis, but I found that there were some challenges, and I'm describing 4 of them here. The first one is a time frame. Mining, of course, happens in a finite period. The resource is depleted. The hole is filled up or not. Generally these days it is. And we move on. The problem is that's the operating phase of the mine. The post-closure phase of the mine is essentially infinite, right? There was no mining, now there's mining, now this is the post-closure phase. And figuring out how to think about potential, especially environmental as well as social costs in the longer term is not so easy. Turns out there are mines in Europe from the Roman days that are still leaching, acid rock, right? Leaching dangerous metals, cadmium, etc. So, wow, that's 2,000 years, different practices then, but how do we account for that? That there's this post-closure phase in which the environmental costs might be uncertain, and how do we even put numbers on them if we can find some certainty? So that's one problem with the standard cost-benefit analysis. Those of you who aren't familiar with the cost-benefit analysis framework, basically you try to think of all the different costs and benefits and put some dollar amounts on them, compare them, subtract them, and see if you have a net benefit or not, right? And I had thought maybe I'd do that, but I confronted this first problem. The second problem is that simply looking at benefits and costs doesn't deal with the problem of distribution. That is, who suffers the benefits and who gains the benefits and who suffers the cost. And typically, mining projects, there's quite a skewed distribution. And that is that the negative effects of the mine, social and environmental, are borne locally, and the benefits could be shared locally, could be distributed nationally, or could go overseas internationally. So you can end up with a situation in the worst extreme where shareholders from Europe or Canada or Australia are gaining the benefits of the mine economically while the local people are suffering the environmental and social costs. So that makes just a plain CBA framework problematic. Thirdly, there's something I just call the poverty of the methodology itself, and it's particularly poor when people are poor. Because, and I really encountered this with the Marlin mine, so I thought, well, I can use a number of indicators to put costs on, number values, on things like contaminated land. The real danger, the real fear that people have in Marlin is that as a result of the mine, agricultural livelihoods won't be sustainable because the water will be polluted. Okay? Suppose that happens. Let me take a value of the land that's lost. We could take a value of the water they might have to buy. We could even take a value of the health costs of people. We could have an estimate of how many people might suffer from various forms of cyanide poisoning or exposure to toxic metals. The problem is that area is so poor that even if the entire place was a disaster area, all 40,000 of the people died or were sick, the whole land value destroyed, you still end up with a pretty small number. And then you're going to weigh that against the large returns that the mine is generating. I felt that that was just both intellectually not rigorous and ethically problematic. So it's not helpful, perhaps, to say that, you know, we can just add up these costs. And in fact, there was a cost-benefit analysis done in Guatemala where they did just that. They assumed that the water was undrinkable, and they came up with a number for having to buy bottled water. Small. For people who are, so that's one problem, the poverty problem. The second problem on this poverty framework idea is how does one value cultural loss? One of the great concerns of the Mayans in this community is they are agricultural people, not just as a means of economic livelihood, but as an expression of their Mayanness. They've always been agricultural producers. If they are not able to do that, they will not be Mayan in some fundamental way. The culture itself will suffer. What number would you put on the loss of a culture? What dollar value? I couldn't come up with a single methodology that even tried. And perhaps you know of some, but it just was not a number one could put on that. And then finally, the ecosystem services are generally excluded in any kind of cost-benefit analysis. What's an ecosystem service? The potential of the watershed to purify water, to regulate climate, to support biodiversity, which ends up, of course, at going for people's livelihood itself. The loss of habitat, of forest resources. These methodologies are now being developed, actually, ecosystem service valuation. But that kind of gets you to number 4 down here. There's no baseline data in this area to even understand what the services are, let alone figure out how to put values on them. So given all of that, I kind of had to abandon the idea that I could do some assessment based on a cost-benefit analysis framework. And that led me to just make up my own, okay? And drawing from many other sources, came up with this idea of a net benefits framework. And the idea is, we can say that mining contributes to sustainable development if it generates net benefits as assessed by these 5 dimensions. First of all, there's evidence of local community acceptance, and that's the free, prior, and informed consent. Why is that so important? Because the trade-offs involved in a mining project. There are jobs today and revenues, but maybe there's a threat to your culture, maybe there's a threat to your livelihood. People are, in a sense, making their own evaluations in the way that they approach the mine itself. So the complexity of the trade-offs for local people, I would argue, privileges them in determining whether there's net benefits, right? And the way they can express that is to say, yes, we generally support the mine and want to work on making it better, or no, we generally don't support the mine because we think it will undermine some key values. So it's an economic decision they're making when they determine, or sort of not an economic decision, but a total welfare decision. Okay? Secondly, and I spent a lot of time on this one, the mine itself has to be lucrative, profitable, generating some real income. But most important is, so how much is being generated by this mine, given the risks, and how much is going to local communities and the national community, both as a total number and as a share of mine revenues, right? Because again, you've got these risks, social, environmental. If you're getting kind of a small revenue stream, maybe this isn't such a good idea for sustainable development. Thirdly, there are total economic benefits of the mine, not just royalties and taxes. There's wages, there's the procurement, there's indirect jobs, the jobs generated by what the company buys locally, and what we call induced spending, the indirect way workers spend money and buy stuff locally, start having a whole multiplier effect in the local community. And then finally, there's the social investment by the company. The company itself could simply put some money into local development projects. So that could be part of the package. Fourthly, is the revenue of the mine being invested in sustainable, productive capacities for the local community and the national government? Because as I said at the outset, the mine will shut, and what's left afterwards? Are the revenues being invested in infrastructure, in education and training, in new sustainable industries that will outlive the mine, that are globally competitive? Okay, that seems a key part of a sustainable development approach. Thank you. And then finally, what's the environmental risk? I abandoned this idea of cost and substituted risk because there's too much uncertainty. You want to look at both the operations and the post-closure phase. And there, risk, I simply try to evaluate risk by looking at the quality of management by the company and by the government. Pretty subjective, but you know, is best practice being used here? Is there transparency? What's the post-closure plan, etc. So those were the 5 key elements that I then used, I should say we used, I had a collaborator from Argentina, to assess the Marlin mine. But my hope is that this kind of approach, this net benefits framework approach, could be developed more and be used for other assessments. You know, I'm not saying this is the be-all and end-all, but we need some framework to say is sustainable development likely here or not. So this is what we're going to use. So let's go with the first one. I think most of you know this story. Evidence of local community acceptance. There are 2 communities, sort of municipalities that border the mine, and one of them, in Zipacapa, voted no in a community, a consulta, an indigenous referendum. You know, 95% voted no. And there have now been literally hundreds of these consultas throughout the highlands on mining. And they have pretty much all voted no. Now, those of you who are economists know there might be a selection bias. The people who want the yes may not show up to the consulta. Fair enough. But this is the expression that there has been. The government of Guatemala had to determine the status of this consulta and determine that it was legal. It was a legal referendum, but it was not binding. It was not effective. Because the government doesn't have a framework in which to understand how to deal with consultas. They don't have a human rights law. They don't have some way of adjudicating disputes. So they had to say, well, it looks legal, but we're not going to pay any attention to it. But the voices have been very strong right from the beginning. And the voices, no, we don't want the mine. So that's number 1. Number 2, is this a lucrative mine? No doubt. No doubt. This is just a kind of a picture of gold prices. This is a gold and silver mine. I think most of you know the story. Gold prices have been soaring in recent years, and even when other commodities are turning down, gold is holding steady. It got up to 1900 at one point. And down here in the gold are sort of average costs of production. So what you see here is a real bonanza in the gold mining sector. Lots of money to be made, generally. In Goldcorp, which is a Canadian company and whose business model is based on the Americas, you can see the growth here, 2009 to 2011, in adjusted net earnings and also in dividends. If you want a good return, and they certainly brag about this on their website, and here's a chart from their annual report. The gold line is the Goldcorp return to shareholders. That sad-looking little thing at the bottom, and the blue one is the Dow Industrial. Okay, so this is an extremely high-performing company in terms of gold returns. Someone's calling on Skype. They come everywhere. One of the reasons they do so well is that they say they're a very low-cost producer, and the green is Marlin. And Marlin is the lowest cost producer of all of their operations in the Americas. In 2010, it was actually negative. That was because they discovered some silver, a lot of silver that they didn't plan on, so they got a kind of a boom even there. So we have a low cost of production, very high sale price in the international market. And here again, earnings in Goldcorp operations. Marlin is a high performer in the Goldcorp companies, suite of companies. 14% over this period where I got the data came from Marlin. I just want to say one thing. Somebody asked me about this. This mine got a $45 million loan from the IFC at the outset, International Finance Corporation. when it was owned by a prior company called Glamis from Canada. Goldcorp bought Glamis, got all its holdings, including Marlin. Because of that IFC loan, the company was required to produce annual social and environmental assessment reports. And that's why we have so much data on this project, really. And to their credit, they did it even when they paid off the loan. So that's where, and now they've stopped. But it's been some years. So this is where the data comes from. So what's Guatemala's share of this bonanza? By law, the government of Guatemala sets a royalty rate of 1%. Right? 1% down from, I think it was about 6.2% earlier, at the behest of the IMF. IMF encouraged Guatemala in the 1990s to lower the royalty rate to attract investment, so they set it at 1%, and that's what they got. They do with taxes as well. If you look here in the green under the total, over this period, the return to Guatemala of the revenues of the Marlin mine has been about 15%. Is that high or low? Let's ask some of the students here. What do you think? Is that a good return?
It's more than they get if they put their money in the bank.
It's more than they get if they put their money in the bank. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it. Okay, they don't have that much money to put in the bank.
They are putting more risk than the bank.
Sorry?
The risk involved is more than just putting the money in the bank.
There's a lot more risk there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And then have more of environment and social cost.
Right, because this is just short term here. We don't know what's happening on the other side of the ledger in terms of what costs they're undertaking. But you know, this is a mine in Guatemala. Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, in fact, in the world. This is a mine generating huge amount of revenue, and they're getting 15%. This is pretty low by international standards. I think that if we were getting 15% returns here in Australia, there might be some political concerns. I'm just curious, what do you think is a return in Australia for?
I know there's people here who can answer that.
Can anybody answer that? I don't know what it is. It's kind of hard, state by state.
Yes, the royalties are different state by state.
I mean, we have royalties up more around between 5 and 10%.
No, but I'm talking about royalties and taxes.
I understand that, but there's been quite a few studies in the last 2 years about this from following the resource super profits tax.
Right.
The industry claims about 30% return. I think that some of the studies by critical NGOs have been down around 19%. So it's probably, they're the two figures that.
Right. So no, there's no common methodology. I tried to find out how this compared internationally. It was a little tough. South Africa looks like it's about 28.
The U.S. is 0% royalties.
But it's taxes. This is what royalties and taxes.
There's no,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I'm talking about just the returns to the government treasury from digging it up and selling it in the market, whether it's taxes are more preferred. People are a little off royalties, I know these days, but this is a return. 15% is royalties and taxes. But this is pretty low, very low, in fact, by Latin American standards, pretty low by global standards. It's hard to find a worse performer, although there might be some in Africa. So this is a pretty low level of return to Guatemala. In fact, so low that recently, just a few months ago, Goldcorp itself volunteered to raise the royalty rate to 5%. The government has not yet managed to change the law, despite some efforts. There's a lot of contention. But Goldcorp itself, facing so much criticism, has voluntarily raised the royalty rate, but reserving the right to lower it if market conditions change. So, they retain the control. But I thought that was interesting, that the company itself actually acted more quickly than the government. So we have one might say then, if you turn it on its head, that 85% of the value of this mine is leaving the country. One would have to say. I tried to figure out who the shareholders were, and they're mostly a lot of big pension funds in Europe, Canada, right? Couldn't determine if there must be some Guatemalan shareholders, but they would certainly be very, very few. So the returns to shareholders of this mine are going outside of Guatemala. What about the other economic benefits of mining? We talked about these, the direct jobs at the mine, how much is purchased locally, how many jobs are generated in the supply, the multiplier effects of wage spending, and social investment. The employment and payroll, this is the AMR, is the annual monitoring report that Goldcorp does. We put it together, at least in these few years, it's about 10 million a year. They say there are about 1,900 jobs at the mine. Mining pays in Guatemala much better than agriculture, better than manufacturing, but still it's a very small wage bill for a company generating quite a bit of money. What about these indirect wages? I'm not going to go to the wall for these numbers. We did some heroic assumptions. We used a multiplier, an average of 2 multipliers from Chile. We found a manufacturing wage from the ILO. But there was one study in Guatemala that said 6 jobs were generated for every job in mining, but with no data. So we said, okay, let's use that. And we came up with some numbers. The important thing about these numbers, of course, is that if they're anywhere near ballpark, they generate that the returns in this economic benefits tremendously outweigh anything they get in revenues and taxes. So that's really where the big bucks are, at least during the operating life of the mine. The problem is that a lot of that depends on local procurement. And the company reports that they source 70% of their supplies locally, but provides no data at all about what it is they're buying. And we found in other studies that companies claim they're buying locally when they import. They buy from local importers. They claim that that's okay. So, we found we said, well, suppose only 50% is really made locally, then the benefits to Guatemala drop quite a bit, right? And drop to about 27% of what they're, are you guys following me with this, non-economists? Okay. So I actually asked the company for this information and said, you guys are pretty good at getting information. Could you please tell us what it is you're procuring? Because, and it's not unthinkable. Sometimes payments are made locally. Of course, energy is a big input into the mine, diesel, trucks. But sometimes those payments are going to local suppliers who themselves do not have any kind of transparency, fiscal transparency. So what money is actually changing hands for what needs to be made much more clear. What about social investment? Goldcorp calls itself a socially responsible mining company. It's all over their website. And they're very proud of the social investments they've made in the local communities. Again, without a lot of detail, they claim they've spent almost $4 million on local development projects. Their biggest showcase is a hospital that they built in the town of San Miguel, Ixtocan. But again, if you kind of look at this $4 million compared to the earnings of Marlin, it's less than 0.5%. They're not paying local taxes, right? They're not buying local water. It's a local community that, if we were in California, a local community taxing the major employer in the community at this rate is getting a pretty poor return. Their biggest claim to fame besides the hospital is are roads. They paved roads in the area. When I was doing this research, I wanted to find out, because by law that 1% royalty rate is split with local communities. 0.5% goes to the local by law, half to the national treasury. So I wanted to know, what do they spend that on? And I was told by a very well-known and respected researcher that if I went up to the highlands and started asking these questions, I would be placing my security at risk. So I was a little circumspect in asking questions. I was told that the mayor had a new house. There is no fiscal transparency at all at the local level. None that I could, or at least certainly not that was shared with us. So this question of the fourth indicator, which is how much of the wealth that they are able to get from the mine is being invested in local productive capacities. I had no data. This is a table of how much Guatemalan social spending in Guatemala as a percentage of GDP. Guatemala is over here. It's a little higher, but we have, in fact, there's a crisis in Guatemala in social spending because the government is not able to really collect taxes. Actually, this mine is the biggest single taxpayer in Guatemala. But whether those monies, there's really, I couldn't find any evidence of any project that said this is our longer term, you know, this is our mineral investment fund. None. I couldn't find it. So those, it's not clear that there's any kind of longer term productive capacities being generated. So let's turn to the environmental risks here. I've got about 5 minutes, so I'll try to wrap it up. And most of you probably are familiar with the litany of problems that from a mining company in terms of loss of topsoil and leaching. In the gold mining sector, cyanide is used to separate the gold from the ore. But the really big problem is acid mine drainage and the potential for heavy metals to leach into the water supply, both ground and surface. This is from the human rights assessment that was done. They figured out which minerals were there in the local area. It's just sort of the scale of the mine, the amount of crushed rock that's put aside, trying to, and that's what potentially can leach over time to waste rock, even when it's filled up. A number of independent studies have found already some cause for concern, especially this one from the University of Ghent found arsenic levels much higher than is allowed by Canadian drinking standards. The government has published no public data on the mine. The data that the government uses to show that it's monitoring the mine comes from the company. Just a quick one here. So the mine was built, and the company has pretty high standards for cyanide management, but it didn't take climate change into account. And this area of Guatemala is projected to have a much higher incidence in heavy flooding, in the sort of once in 100-year floods. This just is some data showing in the past that the change in the number of storms, floods, and hurricanes from 1970 to 89 and then 1990 to 2008. Basically, Guatemala is one of the top 10 countries in the world for vulnerability to climate impacts, both drought in the south and flooding in the north. So the problem is the engineering that was done for one set of specs may not hold up under a climate change scenario. This is just a picture of the tailings dam, which according to the geologists who the company that Goldcorp hired said was vulnerable to collapse even in an earthquake, let alone climate change. The last big thing on climate risk is that there's no public mine closure plan, and Goldcorp has put only $1 million in a surety bond for the event that they, what happens when they walk away. So let me just quickly do the conclusions and we'll come back. Given this poor management by especially the government, we conclude that the environmental risks significantly outweigh the economic benefits. Why? Because the benefits are small and relatively short term, whereas the environmental risk is high due to this interacting set of factors: lack of government oversight, lack of a mine closure plan, climate risk, the fact that the communities are dependent on agricultural livelihood, and this potential for long-term heavy metals contamination of water. So our second conclusion says that the capture of net benefits in this mine, and we might say in mining projects, requires good governance in multiple dimensions. And in the environmental regulation, in the capacities of local governments and peoples to negotiate with companies, in broader development planning, in fiscal transparency and accountability, and in the protection of human rights. And our conclusion is that, and we can talk about this, that there in essence, needs to be some kind of governance capacity index to determine whether there is sufficient governance capacity to suggest the high probability that there will be net benefits in a mining project. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be back here in Queensland. I think it was 1984 when I finished my PhD, and I haven't been back in Queensland since then till today. I don't know if you have a mining school anymore. What's it called? The school.
School of Mechanical and Mining Engineering.
I used to teach first-year anthropology to mining students, and there's a lecture theatre over on the quadrangle that has very steep benches, for students to sit. And mostly they'd spend their time making paper airplanes and throwing them up into the vents, way up in the ceiling. But occasionally some of them would express an interest. I mean, mostly it was like, well, what has this got to do with mining? And I think from Lyuba's talk we can see that there's a lot to do with it, and I hope to say more about that. I'm not going to try to defend Goldcorp. They're not my favorite company anyway. And I'm not really going to talk. I mean, gold mining's kind of got a special space in a sense for a number of reasons, and I don't really want to defend that either, although I worked 14 years for a gold company. And I don't see our discussion as me rebutting what you've said. I mean, I think our interest here is in, because I guess in thinking about what you said, my thought was, okay, so what do we do? And I think this is where particularly my interest is that the social sciences have a major role in making things different. Because mining's never going to go away. Everything in this building, if it didn't get grown in a plant by a plant, it comes from mining. And so that's why gold's a little bit different, although gold has been a precious human commodity for thousands of years. But, in the Rio Tinto space, we produce nickel and copper and coal and bauxite and iron ore, the very material substances of our societies worldwide. And it's almost like those of us in the developed world have kind of said, well, look, we've got our lifestyle. You guys, sorry, but in the interests of our green values, you can't develop. And I mean, it's true in Australia too, with Aboriginal people particularly. So, I want to be really provocative, so we have some good discussion. I've got some questions of fact to ask you, Lyuba, but I'll wait till afterwards. But, in no sense am I here I'm going to defend mining at any cost. But my question remains in response to Lyuba's paper. Okay, what do we do? We need these types of analysis, but nobody's going to give up mining ever. So what can we do to make it better? And I want to put a couple of things forward to you for your information. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that in my 35 years of working with communities all around the world, I worked in Turkey, in Indonesia, in Peru, and most recently in West Africa, in Aboriginal Australia. I've never met a local community, and I'm really not talking about the developed world, who doesn't want mining. And that's for two reasons. One, they often live in areas where there's never going to be another investor that's going to help them lift their economic lifestyle. But there's some profound conditions that they put. They want to have a say in the mining. They want to benefit from it, and not just them, but their children and grandchildren. And they want damage to their environment, social and natural, minimized. I think that's important. These two things: mining is not going away. So we can criticize it all we like, but we should be aiming to constructively assist it to go forward, to make it better and to minimize some of the conditions that Lyuba laid out there. So the other thing is about sustainability, and I'm glad you mentioned the hard and soft versions of the concept, because, of course, we are mining sustainable resources. But the fact is, to my knowledge, no mineral resource has ever been depleted in the whole world's history. And we keep inventing, now we're going to be mining the oceans and then the moon and everything. So I'm not so sure that, it isn't sustainable in that sense. But I choose to not focus on that and rather to look at how a mining activity, a mining company, a project can be a catalyst for other things to happen in the social world and in the economic world. And this is, I think, what a lot of us are trying to get companies to do now. Don't just focus on taxes and royalties and jobs. Allow the mine to be a catalyst for the communities around to build a future for themselves that doesn't directly necessarily involve mining. I always say, piggyback on us. Let's work together to kickstart you, and then you have an economic future that doesn't depend just on mining. So that notion of sustainability, I think, is a complex one. But the other thing is, in terms of involving local communities and ensuring they have a say, you really need vehicles for engagement. And this is where the best social science you can get is absolutely required. And Professor Trigger and I were talking before about the demand for good anthropology, just in Australia, not to mention the rest of the world, is profound. And the reason for that is communities want good anthropological and sociological research, so they have baselines to work from. The companies want good research, so we know who we're dealing with and the best way to engage. And so all of that requires top-notch social science. And I'll never forget my advisor in the anthropology department here was Dr. John von Sturmer. And John's advice to me in 1976 at Lockhart River in Cape York was, look, don't worry about fixing the outboard motors for the Aboriginal people. That, they can do that themselves, but they'll let you do it if you let them. The best thing you can do for Aboriginal people is to do the best possible anthropology you can. It's a legacy for everybody for the long term. And that always stuck with me. And it's even more the case with mining projects and the need for good basic social science data there. But not just engagement. Now, Carol, why is this red light blinking?
I'm not sure.
Are we not plugged in?
Oh, we're plugged in.
It just means there's no battery.
Oh, okay, thank you. It's not just enough to have vehicles for engagement with the community. I mean, every community in the rural areas of Australia as well as elsewhere, comes up with what... I was walking across the Hopevale community once years ago, and I saw this old guy who I knew, and I said, "Hey, old man, which way? How are you going?" He said, "Oh, meeting headache." And they'd just been doing the Cape Flattery Silica Mines agreement. And, the elders were required to go to meeting after meeting after meeting. And we were just talking at one of the Rio Tinto forums about, the dozens and dozens of consultative committees that have to operate now. But I think the aim is not just to yak at each other. It's not just consultation. It's not even just talking and listening. It's really trying to develop a consensus. Firstly, are we going to do the mine? Because I know in the case of Rio Tinto, if a community doesn't want us there with the mine, we're not going to go there. It's not good for anybody's business, and we will not develop a mine unless we have the support, broad-based support of the community around us. Anybody would be mad to do it now. And I think one of the problems in the past, and let me say something about the past. I mean, mining has an appalling legacy. There's no doubt about it. I grew up in the coal fields of Appalachia in West Virginia. The rivers were totally dead. Not a single skerrick of life in those rivers, because the US Steel would dump the tailings waste right into the rivers. And so, that kind of legacy, we have to admit, and we have to say, okay, we have a new paradigm now, we've got new leadership, hopefully we've got fresh blood, and we've got communities who want to be involved. The democratization of the world, the internet, the scrutiny, and so on have all really brought about a fact where a basic part of business is engaging, listening, involving communities on the one hand. And in the case of Rio Tinto, that's led to agreement making. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that. And I've got some colleagues here in the room who can say more if we need to do that in question time about the agreements. I've been involved for about 5 or 6 years in the international debate around free prior informed consent and the move of the International Finance Corporation and the Equator Banks. And together they fund about 80% of the extractive projects in the world. Have been debating about, well, is it consultation or is it consent, and how do you know you have it or don't have it? Is it majority, is it a veto power, all these things. And so, we talk about FPIC now in the mining industry. And the more I learn about Rio Tinto's agreements, and I've only been with the company since September last year, the more and more I think that we have a defensible case that we have broad-based support for a mining operation. And I'm going to give you the examples of Lyuba, which I just spent some time at recently, but also my own experience with the previous company, Newmont, in developing community agreements in West Africa, in Ghana. So agreement making leading to consent, and then beyond that, another factor is local benefit sharing. Because you know, I mean, as companies, we really, the royalty and taxes bit, we know that's never going to trickle down. That's going to go into central government coffers and nobody will ever see it. So we've really almost given up on that. And it's okay, we have to pay taxes and royalties, but let's look at mechanisms we can build so the community can directly share in the benefits at the local level. And not only that, but that there can be endowment aspects to that. So it's not just money for Toyotas, you know, gone tomorrow, there's long term. And so I'll give you a couple of examples of that too. And having said all that, I need to just figure out where I'm going here. Oh no, just another little story. 32 years ago, I turned up as a fresh PhD anthropology student at Wudjil on the Bloomfield River south of Cooktown. No electricity, no water. The houses that people did have were one-room tin shacks with dirt floors. And on and on and on. I mean, it was really an amazing sort of, the beauty of it was that the people were so wonderful and they were homogeneous culturally and linguistically, and they had only recently come under the influence of the Lutheran Church and the mission structure and so on, and had avoided a lot of the worst things that many Queensland Aboriginal people had suffered under the hands of various Queensland governments over the years. And, you know, I mean, with a very vibrant social life, you very quickly lose, you forget that you're living amongst people in absolute dire poverty, and you focus on the richness of their social life and so on. But basically it was like more than third world, I'm telling you. Last week I went up to Lyuba, and I know that there's still issues and problems, and there's a terrible legacy there when people were moved and the government burned down everybody's houses and so on. But I went to Napranum, which is it south of Lyuba, Ben? Yeah. So it's an Aboriginal community of about 1,000 people, and people are going to jump on me for this, but this was just my gut feeling. Driving with one of the Aboriginal employees around the community, there were houses. They had satellite dishes on the top. There was electricity. There were pretty good cars in people's driveways. The rubbish was picked up. I mean, the things we take for granted. And you can say, well, that's just assimilation. They're turning them into middle-class Australians and so on. But the difference in the physical quality of life between 30 years ago at Wudjil and today in Lyuba was absolutely profound for me. And I started thinking, well, why is that? You know, because it's really not that long ago when, you know, say prior to 1990, when things were still pretty messy. But since about 90, when was the first Lyuba agreement? 2001. 2001. A lot of effort was put in and a lot of input from social science people and very qualified anthropologists working with the Land Council and the local people to develop formal agreements about how and whether and on what terms the mine would proceed, not just now but into the future. Lyuba's been mining bauxite for 40 years and there's probably another 50 years. And that's another thing about sustainability. I checked up the other day from a number of sources. The average life of a small business anywhere in the world is 5 years. And so we have to say that, you know, these shops are unsustainable as well, these businesses. That includes small-scale manufacturing. So, but here, I mean, you've got a base to work from. Okay, the mine will close one day, and we have to plan for that. But you've got enough time, if you put it structured properly, for Aboriginal people to develop their own businesses and their own interests and not just worry about jobs and then whether royalties and taxes are going to come back. Let me just show you, and I'm not by no means an expert on this, but I was so impressed with what Lyuba's done, both the communities and the... So mining operates in Western Cape York now on the basis of what's, and only in Australia would you do this, it's called WACA. And the WACA is the Western Western Cape Communities Court. What's the WACA? The WACA is the agreement.
Agreement, right.
Yeah, coexistence agreement. And, it covers virtually every single aspect of the mine, its impact, and the interaction of the mining company with the Aboriginal people. And this agreement was signed off by 11 traditional owner groups with very deep legal and anthropological advice going to them direct through the Cape York Land Council, by the Shire Council, who else, Ben? The Cape York Land Council, the Queensland Government.
Four community councils and Camalco at the time.
So 4 community councils, so a very large body of people who signed the agreement and who developed it. It took, what, a couple of years to do?
5 years.
5 years. So nobody's saying this is easy, but if the mining industry wants to proceed and operate on indigenous land or local community land anywhere, this is what has to happen. Full-scale agreements negotiated which are binding in law and which govern all the activities going forward, not just today. But the other bit I wanted to show you with respect to this is the vehicle that's specified in the agreement for governance. And here's the signatories to the agreement across the top there. This is the agreement, and then it has 3 components. It has an executive, who are the administrators, and that has a secretariat of what, half a dozen people?
10 staff.
Yeah, and until recently it had a very, very strong and effective Aboriginal woman running it. And then on the right-hand side is the coordinating committee, which is kind of the governing body of the whole thing, and they oversee the implementation of the agreement and so on. And then you can see the subcommittees that are set up there under that coordinating committee. Over here, though, is the benefit and revenue sharing mechanism. And so with this trust, it's divided into the 3 major areas that the whole of Western Cape York, from Arakoon all the way up to Bamaga, covers. And these are the groups that, what's the funding mechanism here?
So basically, under the agreement, both Rio Tinto and the Queensland Government contribute annually. And
it's based on production of bauxite, though, isn't it?
Rio Tinto's contribution is based on our production, the price of aluminium. About 60% of the contributions, the traditional owners decided they wanted that to go into a long-term trust that's for future generations. A portion of that, a small portion, goes into the actual administration, that function in the middle, and then the remaining 35% gets distributed evenly 3 ways across those sub-regional trusts. The directors of those sub-regional trusts are the traditional owners. They're not company representatives, and they decide, then based on the guidelines of charitable trust, how those monies are distributed.
So roughly, I'm sorry, this is Ben Laidlaw, the General Manager of Communities for Weipa, Rio Tinto Weipa. How much money a year comes in overall?
About
$6 million. And how much is invested in the endowment fund? It's at least 25%?
Yeah, so basically the traditional owners for the long-term trust have just last year, all of the documents are available on this website, have signed off a long-term investment strategy, and that strategy is about, at the end of the day, this is all public on the website, over that initial 20 years of mining, getting to a point where they have about $150 million in the bank, which means at that point, if mining was to stop and not to continue at all after that those sub-regional trusts, the traditional owners from across the areas of the mining lease, would continue to receive contributions equivalent to what they're receiving now whilst mining is happening. So, and that would basically continue forever and a day based on that investment strategy.
Right. So, I mean, it's a tremendously complex thing, but I was so impressed with, and I talked to traditional owners. I went out bush several times and talk to them separately without other Rio Tinto Weipa people there about how this is functioning. And, you know, it's the way of the future. I mean, I can see that no companies would, like Goldcorp could not go into Marlin I reckon, in 10 years and not do this sort of thing. And it's completely transparent. You know, the whole structure and the minutes and the budgets and everything are audited and available publicly and so on. So I just want to quickly, I've got two more things to do because I want to raise open it for discussion about both of our papers. The other one that I've been involved in for the last quite a few years is a gold mine in Ghana. And I just want to say talk about one aspect of it, and this is another mechanism by which communities can benefit from the revenue streams that can come. But once again, it's not dependent on government. So in the case of Ghana, Newmont knew that we had to pay a 3% royalty to government, and we had to pay taxes and so on. But we knew from history and from developing a sound knowledge base in the country that the money would probably never come back, or it would just come back in little trickles. So we committed very upfront $1 an ounce of gold and 1% of net profits to go into this foundation. And in parallel, the Newmont Ahafo Social Responsibility Forum was set up, and that was 55 people with all the chiefs, the Queen Mothers, the youth leaders, the local government people, and a few company people as well. And that forum was set up as really a consultative mechanism, an engagement, and with a peak body to discuss major issues. But in the middle of all that, the three paramount chiefs came to me and they said, look, we've never had mining here. We don't know anything about it. In this region, it's always been subsistence agriculture. They said, we want the investment. We welcome you here. We know you've done an investment agreement with the government of Ghana, and we appreciate the fact that you guys insisted that it go before the parliament so that every aspect of the agreement was public. But what you know, and you guys, you know, we get on with you and you might promise us this or that, but we know that all you expats leave, and you know what happens when the next manager comes along. They said, we want an agreement with you that sets down very clearly what you're committed to and what we as communities are committed to. And so we spent 18 months then developing an agreement, and I had no experience of Rio Tinto's agreement making over the last 10 years in Australia, but we did kind of roughly base it on what happened in the Argyle area and with the agreement there. But we spent 18 months working with the leaders in the community and others, local NGOs as well as women's groups and so on, and out of that came three major agreements. One focused on the nature of our relationship. What are we all trying to do, and what are our roles and responsibilities as communities and as company? And that laid out complaints, managing complaints, right through to you know, the use of lawyers in a dispute and things like that. But basically it's a good faith statement on all our parts that we both want this to happen. How are we going to do it? How are we going to work together? Second one was around employment, and that very high unemployment of youth in this area. They wanted training, they wanted capacity building, and they wanted jobs. They also wanted local business. The local content supply chain side of it was critical as well. And the third agreement was around a vehicle to sensibly use the revenue from the mine. Not the royalties that government gets, and some of it did eventually come back, but the foundation, the $1 an ounce and the 1% of net profits. So the Newmont Ahafo Development Foundation was set up, and we didn't want the name Newmont there because it's not a company foundation, it's a community foundation, but the local people insisted, and I think they felt it was a way of keeping us trapped, if you like, by having our name on it. But you know, it really is meant to, there's minority roles for the company on the board, and the company really makes no decisions around how the money's spent. But because that was all developed by the forum and is in black and white in the agreements. And so what happened was, the way this works, there's 10 communities around the mine, and we spent a lot of time defining the criteria for who's the local person. Very important. And those 10 communities, a sustainable development committee was set up in each community, and people were elected by their own communities. I think I have a diagram here, and I'm not far off, Carol.
No, we're good.
Anyway, in the agreement, we laid out what areas were important to the community. What do you want to do with this money? It's not up to the company, it's up to you. And so they laid out areas like capacity building and training, cultural heritage, infrastructure and health, and so on. And there was a percentage put against each of those things. And then the other agreement was a very interesting thing, and this came from the local chiefs. They wanted an endowment aspect to it. And so for the first few years, that 10% of the money is is invested. In the second 5 years, it's 20% that's reinvested. And in the third 5 years, it's 25%. So like with Lyuba, they're going to end up with millions of dollars, you know, long after the gold mine is gone. And, you know, you can see some of the, I mean, this is all on the website, so you can see. And the other one, it took a while for them to get things going. And so by the time they got things going, there was about $3 million in the bank. And first thing they wanted to spend money on was scholarships for their kids. So hundreds of thousands of dollars was put in scholarships for their kids, which to me really tells you about their priorities. It's about the future. And so this vehicle has been operating very successfully now for 6 years. And I see agreement making leading to effectively consent. There's still some debate, and we have yet to see how the IFC's performance standard number 7, which is Indigenous peoples and consent, actually plays out. You know, the consent side of it, leading to what Lyuba's doing and what Newmont's done in Ghana, you know, major agreements, and then vehicles for wisely and sustainably using the money and the benefits that come from money. These are the preconditions. Now, the other things I just wanted to touch on before I close, that you know, we're not in a bubble. These mines are not in a bubble. You know, you're in a broader political and social context. And I just sat down and jotted some things down about, okay, if you really wanted sustainable mining, defined as I have, what is required? And so I'd start with a relatively stable, transparent, non-corrupt central government. Now, if anybody knows where any of those are, let me know. But also a government that wants to use foreign direct investment and to use it, you know, invest it, not for the money to go to the elites. Secondly, it needs a mining law that balances attracting long-term involvement by investors and who will look after the environment, but balances central government revenue with local government revenue. Thirdly, contract transparency. I've been involved for a number of years in a global initiative called the Governance of Extractive Industries, and it's called GOXI. And there's a wonderful website that looks at it. And it's part of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a worldwide movement to get companies to report what they pay to governments. So contract transparency. And then another one is working through and within the existing economy, not replacing it. This is the resource curse, where mining comes into some of these countries and just blows away all other economic activity because of inflation largely. The next one I had was local content, and you know, the whole issue around building supply chain locally. The IFC has a very wonderful business linkages program that teaches communities over several years to build their capacity to supply to the mine. We did it at Ahafo in Ghana, and after 3 years there were 300 local companies doing about $15 million a year worth of business with us. And those were businesses that could go anywhere. They weren't just dependent on the mine. Local employment, which in an area where people don't speak English, they don't read and write necessarily, they have no history of working in an industrial setting. You know, the capacity building is considerable, and a lot of investment needs to be put into labor pools where people are trained to turn up to work on time and to be safe in what they do, as well as learning skills like electricians and so on. I think, you know, you really need to define and understand the local social environment. You know, you've got, especially in communities where there's mixed ethnicities, you know, you need to understand the dynamics of those local communities. We're working on a project in Guinea right now where there's 4 major ethnic groups. And, you know, the complexities of that impact your business big time. And so you better have people that know what they're doing and can understand that. And I think I'd mentioned a foundation or other vehicles for true participation in decision making, as well as spending the money in a sustainable way. Partnerships are a key. Increasingly, mining companies, I mean, I can't stand the sort of things like Lyuba that you mentioned, that they talk about the hospital they built, and you know, spending money like that makes the chairman's wife feel good, but that's about all it does, because in the end the community don't own it. They say, you built it, the roof is leaking, you come and fix it. And so, you know, the partnerships around health, education, I mean, mining companies are just big dopey mining companies. We don't know about education and health, and so increasingly we're partnering with NGOs that do know how to do these things, and it's essential going forward. Monitoring and evaluation, you know, scrutiny from the outside world. The AHAFO project was also funded by the IFC, and we had 4 audits every year for 5 years, and they're all published on the website, the company website and the IFC, warts and all. That kind of scrutiny really lifts your performance. And then finally, I think, you know, it sounds simple and it sounds like peace, love, and kibble wheat, but look, you know, listen, engage, talk, and have mechanisms where there's serious representative consultation between the company and the community. So that's just a brain dump, and you know, hopefully it'll provoke you into some discussion one way or another about what's going on. But mining's not going away, and it's institutions like this one. It's your job, Salim, and your job, David Trigger, to produce social science people and miners who understand the business imperative of these sort of factors. And only then can we have something like sustainable mining. So thanks very much.
It is a good question. Even, let's just take one of them. I mean, I'm no expert. It's been a while since I was working in Australia, but I'm really worried about the mineral boom here. As a macroeconomist, the first thing I encounter is that per capita, the budget deficit in New South Wales is about 3 times that in California, and we're killing each other in California with the budget deficit. You know, where's the investment in the sustainable productive capacities here?
Sure.
Why is there an infrastructure question? I mean, I'm going to ask you these questions. I mean, so something, I mean, you know, and this is really some of what I wanted to ask Chris as well. It's easier said than done. You know, it's easy to think it up in a way, but implementation is tricky. There are real differences. This question about local support seems to me, the gas development here in Queensland is a good case. There's tremendous conflict, and it's not clear who's going to win. What are the rules of that conflict engagement? And you come to Guatemala, and there's a paucity of rules. And without some government rules, you know, I love the agreement thing, and I know Oxfam is doing this. This is the way forward. But Lyuba, in your frame, you know, the government was in there. Queensland is guaranteeing, you said the agreement has legal status. Who's providing the legal status? You know,
Well, it's part of the native title regime.
well, that's what I'm saying. There's laws.
It's federal law, yeah.
There's laws in place there. So, but even here, the engagement about the real differences of opinion in the community and how they get resolved. You know, I don't think we have a sufficient governance framework to do that. But hopefully, my hope is that with a better intellectual framework, knowing what needs to be done, that can facilitate the discussion at least. But why it doesn't happen, it's easy to point to bad government. But what my case study showed is that if you don't have some decent government, you can't do sustainability. You just can't. And part of what I think needs to be focused on is how the government can better engage the mining sector in a sustainability framework.
And this is where the international financial institutions have a big role to play. I mean, the World Bank has a huge amount of sway in the developing world. And I think they have a role and are playing it to a large degree to lift the standards of governance with respect to extractives. And then particularly around transparency as well.
Yeah.
I mean, companies won't be able to invest in they won't be able to get money to develop in countries that aren't, you know, abiding by these sort of frameworks.
I'll just say one last thing. I mean, that there's a great inequity in the agreements, I think, is a way forward, but, you know, the mining companies have a tremendous sway. You know, you come to a community and, you know, the question of the accountability of the sector as a whole somehow, the company, I mean, and here, this is, I was curious to ask you, Chris, that it seems to me that the sort of forward-looking and cutting-edge work that Rio is doing, how does that become a kind of a norm in the global community, and how is that governed? I mean, it's fine for you guys to negotiate around benefits, but what's a fair return? And how do you determine that? And, you know,
I don't think you can look at it in the abstract. I mean, you have the people we're accountable most to are our local communities. Firstly, because we won't have a business if we don't have that, and secondly, our shareholders. We're public companies and we're beholden to shareholders. But and the other thing, I mean, the juniors always complain to us saying that you guys are doing these things to block us out of the market because we can't afford all this fancy social responsibility stuff. And mostly I say that's absolute garbage, because treating people with respect and talking to them and listening to them doesn't actually cost a lot of money. What costs a lot of money are these silly philanthropic white elephants that companies pay so much money for. But no, I don't know. I mean, I'm not so sure I can or want to justify the industry. But then again, it would be like comparing Queensland University to Whoop Whoop Technical College. I mean, the fact of the matter is companies have different standards and different ways of doing things, and we think that the way we're doing things gives us a competitive advantage in the global market. Not only with in terms of financial success, but in terms of reputations with governments who actually ask us to invest in their country as opposed to asking Goldcorp. Other countries, but I mean, many of the treaties in the US still have force of law, and Indians are taking the government to court and getting billions of dollars for the breaking of those treaties. So, I mean, they didn't work very well, and the government broke them over and over and over again, but they still have a force of law. The agreements here, I mean, they don't have sunset clauses, to my knowledge. Does the WIPA agreement have a sunset clause? And all of them have regular review clauses, so that people have to sit down and look at them and so on. Obviously, well, mostly they include closure commitments as well. And those are monitored and evaluated, and people put up money against them and so on. So presumably the agreement goes away when the mine goes away. But by then you will have iteratively reviewed the conditions of the agreement and whether things have been met or not. We have evaluations about these agreements every couple of years, every 3 years. But I think, you know, once the mine goes away, the agreement dissolves, basically. But they too have force of law. I mean, an Aboriginal group can sue the company if they think we're not living up to the commitments in the agreement.
Lyuba would like to respond.
what I thought when you said that we're not the formal treaties, but, you know, of course in the States we have this big story about the beads that were given in exchange for Manhattan, you know, and happening a lot. And this was an aspect of this case study that I found really problematic, which is this very, very poor community. And there's no doubt that the jobs are welcome, that, I mean, the hospital is welcome, for Pete's sakes. But, you know, when I spoke at the University of Ottawa, the company, Goldcorp, had given the university there $25 million as a gift. You know, the people in the local community got $3 million over 4 years. I mean, there's something about, this is why I wonder about the international norms. You're making these agreements. When you go in, you know, shouldn't we be thinking in terms of what sort of framework do we sort of agree is right as against, you know, this is a really much richer community and they can really push, so they're going to get more. And these guys should be grateful for these crumbs off the table. I mean, I'm not saying you guys do that, but, you know, without some sense that we're on the same page of, you know, what might be fair. And I love the flexibility that some communities care more about this or that, but don't we need some general idea that, you know, what should be in a mine closure plan? And what is a kind of a fair return? What's a ballpark negotiating figure that we're talking about? And what is best practice in long-term environmental monitoring, or, you know, we need some sense here. Otherwise, each agreement is going to depend on, in a sense, the goodwill of the company and the negotiating skill and of your, you know, your partner. So that's where I'd love to go.
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have world government yet.
No, we're not talking about.
And you know, but those sort of norms do exist. I mean, the International Council on Mining and Metals does produce best practice guidance notes on most of those areas. And then in the case of Rio Tinto and Newmont and Anglo American, all the majors publish, you know, what we all think are the best way to do things. And we want scrutiny and critique of those things. That's why we work actively with NGOs like Oxfam and so on. We don't always agree, often we don't, but you know, we realize that mining industry, probably more than any other economic activity in the world, attains enormous scrutiny, and reporting now is just warts and all. So I don't know, I think we're getting there, but I can't really imagine what it would be that would achieve what, you know, you're describing. I mean, it's a great ideal, but with so many governments around the world and so many companies and so on, and frameworks, there's, you know, I'm not sure how it could easily...
I don't have a question so much, just to highlight this point that Daniel Franks here from CSRM, just to highlight this point that I think is emerging, that we can think of global norms or international norms or the norms of the leading mining companies, but I think what is more important is that most of this norm making is actually coming from listening to communities and listening to governments. It's actually the flow back the other way that's important. And I think one of the things I've learnt from the IM4DC engagement, which Chris just mentioned, which is a major program of work funded by AusAid with the support of SMI here at UQ and the University of Western Australia, is actually there's probably more policy dexterity in African countries around minerals management than there is in Australia and in Canada. Perhaps practice is that there's a total disjunction, right? Practice and effectiveness and governance in that setting. But in terms of policy dexterity and the ideas and the norm making, there's a lot to learn there, a lot to learn for us here. So I guess just to highlight that point, that there is a two-way process of norm making on what is appropriate in terms of mining, and a lot of the interesting and creative stuff comes from listening.
I just want to make a comment that harks back to what Chris said. I think this question of what's a fair share, and also how best to design the flow of that share is really what's on the agenda, certainly on the agenda here, locally, et cetera. You know, what is the policy framework that makes sense, you know, as against slapping a high royalty or a high tax, or how better to do, and I think that's a lot of what needs further research. But this question of, and I agree with you, the engagement that has pushed up the notion of what is considered a fair share, and sometimes it's called resource nationalism, is in fact quite conflictual. So, you know, people pushing for it. So it comes from both sides, I think, but also some new mechanisms by which the revenue is shared. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about the mineral tax here in Australia, but we could go there.
No, let's don't. We need alcohol to do that.
Alcohol, all right.
You know, I mean, it's always a negotiated settlement. In a sense, I mean, I'm stereotyping your comment, but you know, I've been through a few divorces, and it's almost like saying, okay, well, what's a fair settlement in a divorce?
In California, it's 50-50.
Well,
That's the starting point. And if you don't get 50-50, it can be 70-30, and people feel like it's a great deal. That's all I'm saying.
But, you know, Zambia quadrupled their mining royalties, and everybody just stopped coming. Couldn't afford it. And the mines minister said to me personally at a meeting in Paris, we made a huge mistake.
Right.
And the following year, they went back to the same old royalty before, and everybody came and spent money there. I mean, it's a negotiated settlement. It really is a kind of marketplace. And that, you know, and as long as you've got parties on more or less an equal footing negotiating, then you're going to get something that both sides think is fair.
But that's my point. They left because they could get a different royalty rate elsewhere.
No, they just couldn't afford to mine in Zambia.
Okay, well, maybe both,
Yeah,
some combination.
yeah. I
was going to say that really comes through in the study from Guatemala, and You know, I know we all like to complain about government, and rightly so, but man, it can get a lot worse. You know, the people in the highlands of Guatemala, they don't feel they have a government. They feel completely cut off. They do not feel they can, we're talking about litigation solutions. They don't feel like there's a court they can go to, there's no advocacy, they feel, this is a place where 120,000 people were killed by the government not so long ago. My point really was that for companies that, and I was really pleased to hear that you guys do this and Rio Tinto, that at some point there's a tail on this distribution, that it's so bad that there's no way you can work here at all. You know, and the international community said that about Burma at one point. You know, we're just not going there until things improve. And I actually put it to the company, to Gold Corp, isn't Guatemala's kind of in the same position? That there's no way you're not going to basically screw somebody over here big time. I mean, I said it nicely, but, you know, but yes, trying to improve the government capacity has got to be part of the story.
So I'd like to just thank everyone. We'd really like feedback on the format of the event. You know, I'd like to have more public events at CSRM, which are more in this kind of conversational format where we get practitioners and academics together, people from different kinds of communities of interest, government officials. So I'd also welcome suggestions for speakers who might be coming to town, like Professor Zarsky was happily vacationing in Byron Bay, and we didn't have to pay her ticket from Los Angeles or from San Francisco no more. So we were very fortunate that way, and this may happen opportunistically with others. Please feel free to send me a quick email or any of our staff. I'd also like to mention and thank Dr. Diana Kemp, who had to leave early because she had to catch a flight for Sydney, but she was also very helpful in recruiting Chris to come. We would like to really make this more of a UQ community effort and engage CSRM with the broader UQ community. So special thanks to those of you who came from outside these hallowed grounds.